Hello, I'm Li Hao. So today I'm going to talk about component API in Svelte, specifically server-side rendering component API. If you've watched my previous video, it's about client-side component API, meaning you can import components on the client side, which is in the browser, and then you try to instantiate a class and to mount it on the DOM, and then you can call like the set or aunt to set the props, call some functions, or listen to component events in the runtime. Right. So, but today we're going to talk about more on the server-side kind of things. Right. So, Svelte supports server-side rendering, meaning Svelte can actually provides a method for you to call, which returns a string, which is like a HTML string, which you can then return to a user. So this code can run it on the server, and whenever someone tries to query something from you, you can return some contents to the user. So the content can be dynamic. Maybe your site is about food blog, and every time user visits a different URL, you want to return some different foods. Then it's good to have this function in the server side where you can call and then returns a UI HTML content, HTML string that's rendered for different food, right? So you have this function that returns, and we're going to talk about this function, which is the server-side rendering components API. So here we are looking at the same examples that I prepared for client-side component API, the same old components that we have. But one thing is different right now is that we are going to stare at the JavaScript output for a while. So this JavaScript output is what you would expect from client-side codes, right? This is what you expect to be run on the client side. You see methods like mounting elements. Sorry, let me just open on the component of Svelte. You see codes like creating elements, mounting elements. You see codes like listen to component events, handle it, set the component elements values and things like that. And then last but not the least, you see that this is exporting default the component, which is a class which you can use to instantiate and mount on the DOM and call the methods that I've said earlier on. Right, but do you know that there's a compile options for Svelte that will compile this code that you write, the same old code that you write, but compile it for server-side rendering, which is the function I just mentioned, where you can call this function and return you a HTML string. Amazing, right? Same piece of code can compile to JavaScript that's adding elements on the DOM, as well as can compile to a function that returns a HTML string that can be run on the server side. And you can use a flag on the compiler to turn this on, which is called the generate. Right? By default, it's set to DOM, which is for the client side, but you can change it to SSR, which is to export a function that returns a string, right? So if you take a look at here, still again, it is exporting default components, but now you look at the component itself, it looks different now. And it feels like a function over here where you can see that this is a function that returns pretty much like a string, right? Returns a string. So it's a pity that you can't really run and try server-side rendering components API or server-side rendering at all on the REPL. This is meant to be interactive and only for client-side rendering only. So what we're going to do is we're going to download this example, and we are going to try to run it ourselves, right? So that we can verify how this works. Okay, so before I start running anything, I want to bring your attention over here in the rollup config. This is the config file for the basic setup for to start to compile your Svelte component and start a dev server. So here, if we scroll to look at Svelte, you'll see here we're passing in compiler options. This is exactly the same that we are looking over here, compiler options. And now I want to change a bit. I want to add generate to SSR so that we are generating server-side rendering code instead. Okay, so I changed to generate SSR, and now I try to run this yarn dev. And before we run anything, we're gonna now take a look at the main.js, right? So previously in the previous video, I said I want to throw all this away because I'm going to take a look at just the component.svelte. So I am going to import that component.svelte. But now I can't really instantiate this like a new component and mount it on the DOM. It does not work that way for server-side rendering now anymore. So server-side rendering, what you import, you still get the export default, right? As we see here, export default is the component, but this component itself has only one method, which is component.render. Only one method. So this is where you this is the function that I mentioned previous all and again. This is a function that returns you a HTML string. So I'm going to console log that because it does not really returns a HTML string per se. It's returning an object, and then object contains some HTML string and some other information that you would want to know about. Right, so I just gonna console log everything out. So I'm gonna call this function. So if I come over here and try to open this browser, open the ports, you'll see nothing because we are not mounting anything on the DOM. But if you open up the console, let me drag it all the way up, you'll probably see that it's printing up some content, right? CSS, head, and HTML. So you can pretty much see that the HTML is the you can pretty much guess that HTML is the HTML string that I mentioned, but you also see strings like head and CSS. So if you have a style tag in your component, then you probably have something in the CSS, which is some CSS code that you would want to add to your in your HTML that you want to return to the user. So usually what you would do is you probably come over here and piece everything up into one nice HTML document and then send it to the user. Send it to the user, right? So here let me try to instead of doing that, let me just have a quick code to show you how that would roughly works, right? So first is in this object you have CSS, you have head, and you have HTML. Okay. So now so first thing, let me try. How about let me do this. Let me come over here, and in the body, I am going to add a pre tag, and I'm going to add all the contents over to the pre element. Right. So here I'm going to document.query selector pre dot inner text equals to the HTML. So now you can see that this is the HTML string that is being written, right? You get a div, basically everything that you can think of, right? Let's see, and I think what we want to focus our attention is over here. First thing is, so two things, right? So this component that we just written has props called a equals 1 and b equals to 1. So here you would, if you pay more attention, here we have an input that we binds a value, right? The value of a and value of b. So here, if you zoom in, let me zoom in a bit, and you focus over here. I know it's not nicely formatted, but let's try our best. If you focus over here, then I'm highlighting over here, you see that the value is 1. Right? So this is like the default value that you will find in the in your input when you load this HTML on the screen, right? And here you have this second input, value equals 1, and then here you have the product, which is 1 as well. So you can change this by passing a props to your render function, right? So here the render can actually takes in quite a few options so that you can, same component but render different kind of content. Here the first thing you can do is you can pass in a props, says A equals to 5 and B equals to 10. If I save this and I try to, oh, hold on, did I get it right? Let's see. Oh no, okay, so the first argument is the props itself, so there's no props. Okay, so I'm gonna pass A equals 5, B equals to 10. I'm gonna save this, and now immediately you realize that here, same inputs, but value is 5, and this input value is 10. Can you see here the product is 50? So you can see that you can't generate a different HTML string based on the different props that you're going to pass into this component. Right. So of course, it's not just about props. You can also pass in some context. So here, let's come over here in our components. Let's write some context. Import context, get context from Svelte. Okay, and I am gonna get C from context, lowercase c, just in case. And then I am gonna show the value of C. So C. Okay. So here, let's take a look at the docs. It says that second options you can pass in context, which is a map, same thing as the client-side component API. Right. So first thing is we take a look here. It says C is undefined. So we're gonna change that. We're gonna come over here and pass in the context. Right. So here we're gonna create the second argument. It says context equals to new map C equals to 10. Whoops. Let me make it 20. Right. So now if I come back, you'll notice that C is now 20. So you can pass in context, you can pass in props. And that's basically the extent that you can do with on the server side rendering, right? You can't really change props. It does not make sense, right? You are having a function that just returns a HTML. There's no reactivity or whatever that you intend to, because this HTML is just going to be sent to the client, and then the client browser receives it and renders it on a screen. Right, and that's the end of the job of the server side rendering. Right, the job is just to return a HTML string. So there's no methods for you to play with change the props, or there's no methods for you to sort of like listen to component events. So the extent of server side component API is just returning a function that returns HTML string. Of course, we said earlier on, there's also CSS and there's also head. So if you come over here, you take a look at this HTML. This is like not a very complete HTML, right? You probably, what you want to send to the client is probably a full HTML document, right? Nicely formatted. So here, let me try to do that. Let's create a template string. So here I have HTML. Right, as how you imagine a HTML, and now I have a this usually goes to the body, so I'm gonna have a body element. Let me zoom it up a bit so they can see clearly. Body, and I'm gonna add this over here. Nicely done. And then sometimes you have a head, right? Where you put in things like titles and stuff like that, right? Title. So let me refresh. You'd probably see like this is more like a nicely formatted HTML document that you would usually use, right? So here, let's come into this component and add some content to the head, right? So what you can do is you can Svelte Whoa, spelled head. And you can add things like title. Why? Can add things like meta. I'm not very familiar with meta text. Let me try to search for one. HTML meta. Okay, this sounds like good enough. Author. Keywords. Okay, let's save this, and let's come over here and take a look at how this head would look like. Right? Oh, I didn't print that out. So let's go back to our editor. Here I'm gonna print out what is in the head. So you see that the head now contains it is also a string which contains everything that we just written in the svelte head element. Right, so let me copy this and let me try to replace this instead. So anything in the head will be head. So if I I don't think I need to refresh. Let me just collapse this down. Now you see that everything is over here is in the head. Everything in the body is nicely your components. So if you have maybe you have a props that is like the title. And you use this props in your title over here like this, then you could also pass in as a props and to change it. So like this is server sites rendering components API. And take a look, here is your title, right? You can pass in title as props, and then you render it inside the svelte head as a title. And when you call a server-side component API to render function to return, then the head will be a string that contains all the elements in the render function over here. And HTML will be everything about that is over here that is not in the svelte head. That will be part of like the body. Right. Lastly, you have CSS. Right. I think we've seen CSS. It's like an object, right? If I come over here, you see CSS is like an object. So you just need to pay a focus on the code, right? So there's code and there's map. So map is more like a source map. It'll be useful if you want to debug something. I believe it will be turned on if you pass in the developer mode to be true. Then you have some more debugging information. I'm not quite sure. This is my guess. Right, but I think the focus here is the code. So here you come over here and say, maybe in the head, you would also have, say for example, a style tag, and then put everything in the css.code inside over here. Okay, yeah, everything like this. So now you see the style also have some inputs. And this class name matches the one that you added. So this has like the CSS class, CSS scoping built into the component. It's not just work on the client side, it also works on the server side as well. So here now I have everything. How about just add this? Let's save this whole thing. Let's copy all this. Whoa, let me try to select all. Copy all this, and let's try to save it into a file. Right, so public, I'm gonna say ssr.html. Let's save all of this into a file, and let's try to open this file. Right, so let's try to visit ssr, and here you have it. You have styles, you have everything nicely done. Of course, you still don't have any interaction because we haven't loaded any JavaScript in it. Right, this whole file that you see over here, if you build page source, is exactly everything that we just copied, being written from the server-side rendering render function, right? So this is what you get. So probably the next thing we're going to talk about is hydration. So the next video we're going to talk about hydration, how you compile the server-side code for hydration and probably how you would try to hydrate it on the client side. Sounds interesting? Well, then you should remember to subscribe to my channel so that you get notified for that video, right? So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, and as I said earlier, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next video is out. So see ya, bye bye.